In opening, I want to take a moment to reflect on the importance of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we're all gathered today. I join you from the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation and acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise with gratitude and respect their ancestral spirits and recognise the continuing connection to land, water and community. I also pay my respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present. It's an interesting time to be having this conversation. Even if we hadn't gone through the 2020 that we have done with COVID-19, I think we would still be having very in-depth, challenging and important conversations about the future of work, the economy, and how it all fits together in the coming decade. But the challenges of COVID-19 have really sharpened that up. In August of this year, the Committee for Geelong had a stakeholder roundtable looking at the future of work. And this conversation series was really an outcome from that, to take what was covered, the sense of just how important this is for our region and our city, and to explore in depth and a little bit more around what's that future going to look like? And perhaps most importantly, what can we do to enable the future that we want to achieve? So to do it for ourselves rather than have something from the outside do it to us. So how do we help shape our future economy? We're using Zoom today. Most of you now, after 6 or 8 months of being digitally connected, will be familiar with Zoom. But just to say, there's a couple of things. We are recording this meeting, and that will be both the audio and video streams, but also anything that goes into the chat function will also be recorded. So if there are comments or in-depth comments you want to make, or questions that you don't get a chance to ask, please do put them into the chat function, because it is recorded and we will make the most of it. The other thing that I'm going to do, we've got a group that's going to be somewhere between 20 and 30 people this morning. And rather than split into breakout rooms, I'd like to keep everybody together. But to make that work, once we get into Q&A, could I ask that folks turn their microphones off if they're speaking? We've got a lot of background noise. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Can I just ask, there's one function that not everybody uses, but it does make this kind of forum work well. At the bottom of the Zoom window, there's a button that says participants. If you click on that, you'll get a white sidebar come up with everybody who's joining us today. And at the bottom of that sidebar, there's a little raise hand function. And if you want to ask a question, please use that rather than waving your hands violently in front of the screen, which we might notice, but equally we might not. And it just enables us to run through the conversation really effectively. It's worked really well for a number of these I've hosted. So housekeeping aside, yesterday's event was a perfect conversation starter with a lot of conversation talking about the report on the 100 jobs of the future, how we build and value a diverse labour force, and what renewable and sustainable industry is going to look like for Australian manufacturing and industry. Before I open it out to a conversation, which will take the most of the time that we have together, I just want to sort of draw your thoughts into a few key areas. Look, I don't need to say that COVID-19 has disrupted just about every industry that we have in the region. Some industries have taken and seized opportunities, but have still been disrupted. Others, for example, tourism, have been utterly decimated by the changes that we've experienced this year. Our own universities had I guess a mixed bag of a year, challenges around international education, but at the same time seeing a huge domestic demand, particularly for short course education. All of that's been layered on top of an already rapidly changing workforce environment. Over the last decade, we've seen many, many changes. Technology has introduced rapid automation, data analysis, robotics, AI, has absolutely changed what we do in so many ways. The traditional jobs pyramid that we've seen in the past, going up through various levels of skills, is now getting absolutely hollowed out in the middle. How do we do about that? How do we think about that? And we've seen particularly cohorts of individuals really challenged by this year. And I'd pull out two: those who are just leaving education to enter the workforce for the first time, and those who were coming towards what they thought were the end of their careers, who now perhaps are having to rethink about restarting in a different strand. All of that comes together. So what about, where do we go in the future? So the 100 Jobs of the Future report highlighted that just about every sector and every role is going to be impacted by some element of automation, robotics, digital technologies, changing approaches to globalization, and indeed having to think about a very different population pyramid. And I think one of the interesting things for me thinking about emerging from COVID-19 is, what does that population pyramid mean for our region? So much of Australia's economic growth over the last few years and skills gaps have been filled by international migration. All of a sudden, that's come to a grinding halt. How are we going to factor that in? What do we need to do that's different? So what are we going to see? Well, we're going to see jobs moving away from the routine to human skills being used where we need human skills the most. We're going to need people who can work across disciplines. Despite all of the technology, the human skills of communication, influence, leadership, dealing with greyness are going to become ever more important. We're going to have more flexibility and adaptability, and we're really going to have a system where lifelong learning becomes the norm. The idea of settling into a career was already almost ancient history. 7 careers now is what people are estimating our graduates will have over the course of their working lifetime. I suspect that might have increased further. We're going to see changes in mix. I've already talked about tourism and hospitality and how that's been so profoundly impacted this year. But that's not the only area. We've seen lots of conversations around sovereign capability, supply chains, and where we need to go in terms of a manufacturing future. What of all of those conversations is feasible, and what is wishful thinking and trying to reinvent something that we're never going to be able to reinvent? What are the particularly unique characteristics of Geelong and our region that we can really shape the working future with? And I think one of the really interesting things this year has been the paradox of, with digital technology, place has almost seemed irrelevant at times, but at the same context, with travel being so difficult, the ability to think about what you have to do within your own region, within your own immediate context, place has been everything. And again, how do we play that out into the future? It has been a hugely challenging year, but I think there are enormous numbers of opportunities and possibilities for the future where we need to go. We've already seen in our region the city reinvent itself with the demise of traditional manufacturing industry, bringing up new high-tech manufacturing. You can't be at Deakin and not mention carbon revolution in any talk about the future of jobs. But I say that jokingly. But what we've seen is we've taken a new technology and created a new industry here in the city. Where else can we go? Where else can we take and adapt that? And importantly, what do we need to do to work with and for the communities around Geelong to actually make sure we have the right workforce for the future? I'm not going to spend a lot more time talking this morning, because the benefit of today is to really get your views and to talk about what I'd like to cover, which is 3 broad themes. The first is your sense of, over the next decade or so, what's work going to look like? Where are the opportunities? Where are the gaps? What are the high-level things that we need to be adapting towards? Taking that, then if that's the future, what kind of skills, what kind of capabilities are we going to need, and how are we going to make sure that we have the right system to get there? And then finally, if that's where we think we're going to go, that's the skill set that we might need. How do we then go about creating, and it's probably an overused word, but I think it is the right word, the right ecosystem of employers, educators, government, and community that actually enables us to make sure that those living and working within the Geelong region have the opportunities to build the skill sets that they need, that the companies have the ability to recruit and retain those with the skills that they need, and that we have the ability to adapt and flex and be agile about the future. So I'm going to stop talking there and really open this out to a series of chunked conversations. I'm going to try and wrap this up by about 10 to 10 so that we can spend the last few minutes summing up and thinking about where to next. And again, before we go on, can I ask you, please do raise your hand to ask a question, but also do use the chat function if there are longer comments or things that you want to put in context to a specific question. So really, I'm going to open it out now and say, right, your views, what's the next decade or so going to look like? What are the challenges in your mind that we need to adapt and flex to make the most of the opportunities and potential that we have around us? So opening it out. So we've got Pat, I think. You just unmute you. That's it.
Yep.
Great.
I'll start with a question because it's something I've thought about for a little while, and I think you're the perfect person to answer this question. I wondered whether the basic school curriculum, if not at primary, certainly at secondary, was running a little bit behind the changes of society generally, and that is more so the case now, where some of the basic skills that we should start think about teaching, and two that come to mind very quickly is one is the power and use of social media, and also basic parenting, whether or not what we've seen now is bringing those into even greater context for what people are going to have to face as a work employee into the future.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Now, I know we've got a number of folks, and I see Phil and others from the school sector there. I'll start with a couple of comments and then maybe ask if those who are thinking about that, is the sort of the compulsory sector giving us the base that we need to go forward? My own view is that schools are faced with an impossible task in that they've got a limited amount of time and they are pressured from every part of the community to do more. Anyone who's ever worked as an educator will say, if you took every view you had from the outside and built a curriculum, it would probably take you 5 times as long as you have to deliver it. But I think what we are seeing is that those who are going to thrive in the future need a really strong, balanced education. You need to leave the school system with an understanding of technology and science, but at the same time, every employer you talk to says those language skills, those soft skills, those abilities to interact with others are really important. So I think making sure that we have that balance, and at the same time, how do we bring in those other soft areas around community, building relationships, all of those other things you're talking about. So I don't know whether Phil or others would like to add a comment around that, but my sense is it is that balanced curriculum and making sure that we're giving as many of our school kids as we possibly can that really solid, balanced platform to go to the next stage of career education.
Yeah, thanks, Iain, and thanks, Pat. I certainly don't want to hog this presentation. Look, I'd actually agree with both of you to a certain extent. I think the curriculum is crowded, mostly with nonsense, and that we're busy spending lots of energy to satisfy goals that may not make a lot of sense in the next 10 to 20 years. So I believe that we in schools need to find opportunities to ignore things and to actually then focus on the students and the partnerships and the relationships that kids can get as they progress through schools and move on to adult life, and then making connections and those broader soft skills with them so that they have a better chance. And for me, working in a school of low SES, that's especially important from an equity point of view, because kids often don't have the connections and networks and infrastructures around them that will make sense and actually then take them on a path. So although it is crowded and we are pressured from lots of different angles, I think we need to find the courage to actually ignore lots of things and focus with the community on what's important.
Thanks, Phil. Other comments around thinking about what that future is going to look like? What are we going to need in terms of meeting, or what does that future of work look like? So I think we've got Carley and then Corey and Vikki. So Carley.
Thanks, Iain. I was just going to add, I think it's really important for us to think about how we create a diverse economy. So thinking back to the work that's occurred in Geelong over the last decade, where we have shifted from being a region relying on traditional manufacturing to a more diverse and knowledge-based economy, and the sheer number of small medium enterprises that operate within the region. And often we tend to look to those bigger companies to kind of set the tone and set the scene for what's happening and what kind of skills we're going to need. But we actually need to think about also all of those smaller organisations that, if we foster their diversity, we can actually create more pathways into work for different types of people and more diverse types of people. And even, if we can strengthen the ability of those small medium enterprises to actually increase their job opportunities by even 1 to 2 employees and increase their productivity, we'll become a more prosperous region. So I find that quite an interesting way to look at things as well.
Thank you, Carley. Corey, I think, is next.
Thanks, Iain. I think picking up on what Carley was speaking about, really focusing on the diversity that's required. I work with multicultural job seekers out at Diversitat, and generally they are such a resilient and flexible group that have gone through so much, and we get the cream of the crop in Australia of those who have come from refugee experiences, and it's very, very hard for them to find work, even though they are so incredibly and highly skilled and experienced. And I think that as we move forward, being able to integrate better some of the skills from people who have come from overseas into our workplace not only creates a stronger and more resilient workplace, it also makes it a lot more vibrant.
Thanks. Vikki.
Sorry, I always forget to mute myself. Just in regards to the question of what my stance of the work, when I look at that, I think of it from a point of view, wherever we learn, we have scaffolding learning, but also there's a big social component of learning, but then there's also the challenge of actually allowing ourselves to transform through learning. So in the workplace, we need to ensure that, I suppose, we build those 3 platforms for learning, having that social component where people can learn from others, but also allow teaching, and I suppose helping people learn that transforming our thoughts, we don't need to be set in the same way. We don't have to have the same thoughts all the time. That transforming is really important so that we can actually continuously improve. So I suppose when I look at that question, that's the 3 things that I feel that we need to have: social learning, transformative learning, and then we can create some transferable skills.
Great. And I think what we're getting from those comments is a sense of themes that are building through. And I think that the first is that sense of community, which is how do we create the sense of community that's going to enable the pathways to work. Secondly, a couple of comments about small business, and undoubtedly our region and probably all of Australia and actually most of the Asia Pacific is absolutely driven, energized by small and medium-sized business. And I think that we have to recognize for the future of work is going to be part of where we go. And that throws down some interesting challenges for us that we might need to think about in creating the ecosystem, because any individual small business is not going to be able to solve these challenges on their own. And finally, I think, and it came through in a couple of the comments, a very diverse community with very diverse range of skills and backgrounds and cultural experiences, and how do we provide the network of opportunities? Interestingly, nobody sort of come up and started with the jobs are going to look like this. And I think that's an interesting comment. I mean, I'm just going to sort of try and get an understanding is how good do we think we are, and how important it is that we actually try and predict, or is it much more important that we come back to some of the principles that people have talked about adaptability, flexibility, and agile ability to change? Because I've got a view that we've spent an awful lot of time as a sector and industry with government trying to predict the details of things as opposed to an agile system. And thinking about the future of work over the next decade, I'd be interested in folks' views. Where do we put our effort? Is it about trying to be clever and predict, or is it about being agile, or a little bit of both? Thoughts? Everyone's quiet this morning. Tracey.
Hello. I love this conversation. And I'm thinking with I'm a careers counsellor, so I'm thinking a bit with my careers hat on at the moment. And probably a lot of the conversation that we have with people now is not so much around, pick a job and what sort of job might you do, but it's more about skill development. So I think from my point of view, making sure that we're really flexible and that we allow people to be able to develop a whole range of skills is probably more important, and other people might disagree, but probably more important for people than, actually knowing what those jobs will be, but having people that can go out into industry and into workplaces and be able to adapt and change depending on what the roles might be that come up.
And there's a couple of other comments that have flipped up in the chat about agile being probably more important than spending a whole lot of effort trying to actually prick out the complete job families that we're going to do. And I think that's actually a really important message for planning, because I think it will signal through where we might go. So look, we're working our way through this, moving it on a little bit. We've had a lot of conversation out there around growing skills in data analytics, artificial intelligence, data, evidence base. All of those we're picking out. And I don't think for a minute anybody recognizes or would say they're not going to be important. But I think one of the interesting things for me is not actually those skills, but how do we provide the right environment so that at all points in education, there are opportunities to adapt and change. And a number of you will have heard me say this before, and I think this is a short-term question, but I'm going to ask it this morning anyhow, is I actually think there is a very real risk in 21, 22, and 23, we could have the worst of all worlds, which will be high job vacancies and high unemployment because we haven't got our structure set up to be able to do the right mix of lifelong learning. So rather than say what specific skills are we going to need, I'd be genuinely interested in this morning as a city, as a region, am I being pessimistic in saying that? And if I'm not, then how do we best go out there and actually work with key stakeholders to minimize the chances of what I think would be just an absolute disaster happening if we did end up with this horrible thing of high unemployment and high vacancies. Am I being pessimistic? And if I'm not, how do we best as a region take it and shape our future of work to best adapt to meet that? Thoughts? Pat? You're on mute, Pat.
Sorry, Ian. I think one of the things we should try to get smart about is that whilst we move away from the traditional of 5 days a week, jumping in the car and driving to town, that as we change from either the 5 days to 3 or the driving to town against the staying at home, what industry needs to do is how do we adapt to that change to create jobs and opportunity that actually pick up the difference. So, for example, if I'm at home for 3 instead of 5, or other way, when that person actually uses those other 2 jobs those other 2 days at home, how do we create industry that benefits from that change? So we need to understand what the change is and where the opportunities are from the change, so that we actually create more jobs in the new opportunity environment. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's great. Other thoughts on how we work through and adapt and deal with what I think is going to be an interesting challenge over the next few years, either from what we need to do in school, in the transition from school into first job or training, or probably just as important going forward, ongoing, short, sharp reskilling, re-equipping individuals to meet. So, Carley.
Thanks, Ian. I think there's a couple of areas where we need to look, and I think you're right to be concerned about some of the challenges that we do have before us. We already in our region, we have some large pockets of unemployment and probably even higher levels of underemployment. So going back a bit to what Pat was talking about with people who might want to do more work and they can't get that because of their work in the gig economy, and which we've now seen is quite precarious, and a number of those people have been extremely badly affected by the precarious nature of that work and the whole change to the nature of work. So I think we've got a whole group of people in our regional groups who are quite vulnerable, and we can all be vulnerable at different times. So how do we actually support those workers to reconnect, or displaced workers to actually reconnect with job opportunities that might be there? So what could we actually do to transfer people who might have some fantastic skills in one industry sector that's been particularly hard hit? How can we actually transfer those skills? And I know there's others around this virtual room that are doing lots of good work in that space, but how do we actually really create those bridges for different people, but not recognizing that we can't stream everybody into the largest industry like health and social services assistance, for example. But I think also for some of our younger people and even our more mature age, it is about fostering aspiration for what the jobs that people can get in the future. So continue to foster aspiration, because we actually are going to have a large group of people, young people who are quite despondent about education and perhaps future job opportunities. We've got some major health and wellbeing issues as well, which I know others could talk about. And we're seeing that come through. So how do we create that aspiration and still foster that within our region, but then give people the confidence to go out and learn and get those skills and to take those opportunities, so that people in our region can actually maximise the opportunities that we get? Sorry, rabbited on a bit there.
No, that's really helpful, Carley. And I think in some ways it's almost going to where I was going to go in the sort of the last third of today, which is, right, what do we need to do as a region to start to address some of this, bearing in mind that we only have some of the levers to pull, because a lot of what we do is controlled by state or federal government or bigger areas than just the immediate region. But that sense of how do we take the community with us, create viable, vibrant, fulfilling career pathways for people that they can see that they can develop within the region. What do we need to do? And I'll get you thinking about it now. It was a question I was going to ask later on, but what I'd like to do in the last 10 minutes, so you can think about it now, is to have everybody either putting their hand up and saying it, or through the chat function, identifying the one action that we think that we as a Geelong region can take to actually begin to address this. Because I think we can talk for ages. We're getting a lot of commonality around what the challenges are. But I think thinking about the future of work, what one action can we begin to take to adjust our sort of employment, education, skills ecosystem so that we're matching and meeting the needs of those jobs for the future? And as I say, I think if everybody came up with one, it would give us a useful platform to begin to say, what can we actually pull out from all of this to actually begin to make a difference? Because I think the challenge is we all agree on the diagnosis. How we put measures to actually implement is going to be a lot more challenging. So in the last 20 minutes of conversation then, we've got elements of that ecosystem here. We've got a passionate, engaged school sector. We've got the Gordon, who's leading a lot of TAFE initiatives. We have Deakin. We've got a lot of vibrant, engaged new industries. How do we begin to shape that ecosystem of employment, skills, training to actually meet the needs of industry, community, and individuals? So, Vikki.
Sorry, I was just going to expand on what Carley, and it probably goes on to what you're saying as well. There's also the employer or the organisation that employs. So we can create transferable skills and upskill our employees, but if there's no confidence from the employer's point of view, and they're I suppose uncertain of how to approach or the current situation, then maybe there's something that needs to be done at that level as well.
Yeah, and I think it is bringing in every player into that ecosystem, say, how do we work together? And I think we touched on the importance of SMEs earlier, and they have, particularly at the moment, a lot of challenges, but they also have a lot of needs and a lot to contribute. So it's how do we bring them into that right ecosystem? Other thoughts and comments around what do we need to do to optimize that sort of ecosystem that we have in and around Geelong? Phil.
Thanks, Ian. It took all my skill to unmute. They're just trying to recognise the thing that you said, that there are elements of what we can't do, which is we can lobby, we can advocate, we can talk about government policy at state or federal level, but basically that's just a conversation we're having. When we talk about what can we do in Geelong, it's really, for me, it boils down to, do we have a collective narrative for what we think Geelong could or should be in terms of the future we're looking for? And in doing that, what's the low-hanging fruit that everyone can buy into? That's employers, education, government, other associated organisations, that they can say, this is the story of the preferred Geelong future, and my part in it is X, irrespective of whether we get state or federal government support. There are things that we can do in that collective narrative to understand our young people and our older people who are possibly needing to change, understand the skill sets, and then create a Geelong-wide conversation around, if as an individual you gain and you desire and you aspire for these skill sets, then actually, if that is known, then you're quite likely to have a successful both career and a successful life as a citizen. So what's the narrative that therefore different parts of Geelong can actually buy into along the story of it takes a village to raise a child?
Yeah. And you put it beautifully, Phil. And I'd be really interested in folks' comments about, as we build that future of work in and around the city, what actually can we do? Because we can talk all day about the challenges. It comes to actually what are the elements that we can actually make a difference with. Thoughts from the group? Guess that we've got silence. That's either everybody is in rampant agreement or rampant disagreement. Are we being naive in thinking we can do this? I don't think we are. But what are the things that we can do as a community led by these kind of conversations that we can actually put things in play to help build the kind of job skills ecosystem that's really going to deliver good growth across our region? Other thoughts coming through? Pat, and then Lindy.
Get my mute right this time. I guess mine's a little bit of a question as much as it is. I just wonder whether or not part of what you're asking is us examining our priorities. And
Pat, we've just lost your sound a little bit. I don't know whether you just go a little bit close to the microphone. It's sort of just faded away.
Oh, okay, is that any better?
That's much better, thanks.
Okay, I just wonder about, do you think there'll be a little bit of an examining of our priorities? And you know, I guess we've been very commercial and economic about our objectives, and has COVID suggested to us that maybe we get a little bit more balance about a healthier lifestyle as distinct from a profitable lifestyle? And do I think we think a little bit more about our environment as a priority? And so do both of those things provide a lot more job opportunity in terms of what Phil's saying about creating the Geelong that we want to see? Now, I know we have to be commercial enough, and spending 40 years in banking, you know, you'd expect me to be that. But I guess one of the things that I'm starting to think is that we do really need to look at the balance. We need to sell the balance as a region, and there's a lot of work to be done to get that balance back in place, especially around the inequity of our region. And does that in itself create a lot of opportunities in terms of work, and does that make Geelong a more appealing location?
I mean, I think, Pat, if you ask me personally, the simple answer is yes, but it's, in my mind, it's then how do we get the challenge? Because I think my mantra is what we're looking for is good growth. And good growth, by that I mean it's growth that benefits across the community. It's growth that's sustainable in every context, sustainable, and I don't just mean green sustainable, but it is not sort of sudden peaks and troughs. It's that ability to sort of see sort of ongoing ability. It's growth that feeds into good quality communities. And if you talk, why do people want to come and live and work in a community? They want a job, but to come for the job, they want an education system that's going to deliver for their family. They want a healthcare system that's functioning. They want the ability to go out and be able to socialize, engage in sport, and all those other things. So I think that part of my challenge is that you can't separate out simply the skill set for the future from all of those parameters around good growth. And for me, if we're going to do things, and it comes back a little bit to Phil's comment about what can we do, it's about putting in place the elements of skills, workforce development that contribute to good growth. And one of the characteristics, I think, of Industrial Revolution 4, or whatever we want to call it, it is about that sense of sustainability, going forward, because I think that everybody is realizing the challenges around climate, around water, around energy are going to impact on everything that we do. So I think I absolutely agree with you, Pat, but again, it comes back to what are the elements that we as a community, we as a group of leaders across Geelong can pull out to actually build that workforce who can help industry build those sustainable, good growth companies.
I think just a further follow-up comment is that I think we've sort of maybe thought about or even started to go down that path in the past, but we've been distracted by the commercial realities of the alternative, and we've allowed ourselves, whether it be a lack of courage or a lack of direction or a lack of leadership. I don't think we should let this opportunity pass and be diverted from what is the obvious position for Geelong to take.
Other thoughts about what do we need to do to begin to shape that future of skills and education, build that ecosystem that's going to deliver this?
Iain, I've been battling to get my hand up. I can't get it to raise, so I'm going to be bold and just butt in. I want to pick up your point about the SMEs and Phil's about the conversation. And I think there's a piece about broadening out that conversation so that the SME skills can be aggregated in some way that's really meaningful for that small business. And I know I've run small businesses or medium-sized businesses myself, and it's hard to, how do you aggregate and join in that skills piece that you need, and how do you be part of the conversation while you're still trying to grow and be part of the supply chain. I feel there's a piece of work there around really engaging solidly with the small to medium-sized businesses.
And I think I absolutely agree. And you don't need to talk to many small employers to say, I'm really nervous about training, because the minute I've trained somebody up, a bigger, more capable industry comes along and snaffles the trainee I've invested the last 3 years in getting there. And again, it's how do you create the right ecosystem so that there's enough skills in there that we can do that. So I'm not sure I have the answer, Bernadette, but I think you pull out a really important point that I think just needs to go on there. Carley, I think, has got a hand up.
Thanks, Iain. I was just going to add to that as well. I think, you know, you talked earlier, or we all talked earlier about some of the strengths of Geelong and advanced manufacturing. You know, we've got a long history in manufacturing and moving more into those advanced fibres and composite materials. There's huge potential there, but also with some of the, how can we link that into that manufacturing sector with some of the other opportunities we have around health, allied health services, support for people with disability, even in terms of agribusiness, and using some of those skills that we're working towards in terms of analytics, digital technologies in the production, a safe production of food and renewable energy. So, and of course, there's a tourism sector. I know it's taking a bit of a battering at the moment, but we will see some opportunities going forward. How do we create that visitor economy? And again, we are so lucky to live in a region with, you know, it is a beautiful region, and we've got lots of opportunities there. So perhaps it's something about how we actually link to some of those major industries. Obviously Geelong as well, we've got the clever creative city vision as well. How do we bring in those principles to look at lifting up some of those industries that then we can cluster smaller, you know, there'll be lots of smaller spin-off organisations as well, and yeah, really create that ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Carley, is what are the flagship things that Geelong becomes known for? And I think obviously there is a background in manufacturing that's continued and morphed and adapted and still sits there. We're probably underplayed in agribusiness. We are in many ways the gateway to Southwest Victoria's agribusiness. and potentially with the Tasmanian shipping line coming back to Geelong, coming to Geelong rather, again, another big agricultural hub, you sort of think there must be something in that as well. And I think also COVID-19 and this sense of sovereign capability, what are those high-tech industries that Australia needs to regroup and regather to give us the sovereign capability we need to the future? We can't compete on everything. So what are the pieces that we can and Geelong can own in this, I think, going forward? And you've pulled out a few. I think there are some others. But equally, I think probably to be brave enough and say, well, that's a nice idea, but actually that doesn't mesh with the capabilities and abilities of Geelong. And no, we're not going to go there. So I think that's the other side of it, is being confident enough to say, no, that's not something we're going to champion and lobby for because it doesn't fit, as I think. So we've got about 5 minutes left before I get to wrap up. Are there other comments around how do we build that ecosystem? How do we work together to make sure that we are supporting employers, individuals, the community to create that skill set for the future of work? Okay. Well, what I'd like to do then, if we're getting sort of now towards the end, is can I ask people, and please encourage you either through the chat function, and we'll keep an eye on it and use it as, or just put your hand up. What is the one thing that you think we need to focus on? I mean, I know there'll be lots, but just pick out the single most important thing that you think we need to focus on to really get the kind of things we've been talking about today, to get some legs, get some energy out there beyond the conversation today. So that one thing, thoughts. Tracey.
I'll be brave and put my hand up.
Yes.
I think it's really hard to think of just one thing, but I think probably from a lot of the conversation that we've had today and from what I've been thinking about as well, that the collaboration piece is going to be so important for us, and to make sure that as a region, you know, the major players aren't competing for things against each other. If we can find ways that we can collaborate on different things. I know often, you know, we will fight for funding with other people that are local to our area, you know, and if we could sort of find a way to, you know, put the competition aside and partner with each other going forward, I think that's probably the most important thing that we could do for our community.
Thank you. Corey, and then I'll come back to a couple of the things that have flashed up from the chat in front of me.
Just thinking off the top of my head and going back to that community aspect that we were talking about before, which I think is really such an important identity with Geelong, like, and even though it's a bit sad, like focusing on the role of the footy club within our community and the importance of that, really looking at how to look at over COVID, the importance, I think one of the things that have come out that's been really good is the importance of leisure, and really being able to tap into that in terms of the arts and festivals and coming together and community events and that sort of stuff, as not just a means of enjoying our pastime, but seeing that as opportunities for new ways of meeting together and communicating together as part of the work, as well. That there is that aspect of it, that we get to meet each other, talk to each other, network, and also have fun, and also support people in that industry to really thrive.
Thanks, Corey. Now, there was a couple of comments that came up from Mim and Troy I saw talking about, and again, it's come in the last two comments as well, the importance of community, which is a sense extending the conversation beyond, and I think that's what Mim and Troy were talking about, extend the conversation beyond, I guess, the usual suspects. And I've been in Geelong for around 15 months now, and there are so many passionate individuals that you meet, but how do we build that real sense of community? Tracey talked about the importance of collaboration. I don't know whether Mim or Troy want to add anything to that. Okay. Couple of comments from Pat about the school curriculum. And I guess I'd be interested that obviously there are sort of senses that there, Phil and school, Pat, they talked about how there are things that we can do and things that we can't do. Phil, I'd be interested from the school, what can we do? Where is our flexibility and how much are we just bounded by that? Yeah.
I think there's lots that we can do in the school curriculum. Over the past 15 years, there's been different alliterations of the curriculum that have allowed for the broader understanding or teaching of soft skills or capabilities. They're often rebadged. They were introduced in a very strong way in what was called VELS, the Victorian Essential Learning Standards of probably about 10 years ago now, and from my perspective largely ignored in schools as we kept focus on the 8 key learning areas. And in the Victorian curriculum there's like a new version of that called capabilities, which I'm not convinced schools are taking on with a joy or enthusiasm, because teachers don't train in the capabilities. They train in a learning area and then broaden themselves into understanding and teaching students. But I think schools can be bold in that space, and if given the encouragement to teach capabilities, because capabilities are valued by a broader community. And if the message coming from government, from universities and TAFE, and from employers, for example, is really powerful, that they want schools to teach broader capabilities to a higher level, and that the students who come out of those schools will be known for it, I think that there's a real chance that then schools will change, because we will change if there's a degree of enthusiasm and pressure to do so.
Thanks, Phil. Now, I'm looking at the comments as they come through. I think that there's a number of themes that are coming through that I think through the colleagues in the Committee for Geelong we need to build on. And I think this sense of ecosystem and community and how we actually foster the right set of conversations around this is going to be critical. I know it's not drilling down exactly into the direct skill sets that perhaps, but I think it's been the recurring message of today, which is if this is going to work, we've got to have a better sense of good growth for the region and actually all contributing to that in a way that is, I mean, we'll never take away all the competition, but as collegially competitive as we possibly can, so that we're building capacity and capability across the region. As I say, I think that's been a recurring theme of what we've got. And Bernadette, I don't know how we pull that into sort of a sense of a recommendation, but I think that's been probably my overwhelming takeout from this morning is there is a real understanding of perhaps where the gaps are. There is a real understanding of the opportunities that this, I mean, I'm a newcomer, but it is a truly fantastic region to live and work in, has, but perhaps, I'm trying to put this right, everybody is quite struggling a little to know exactly what is the one or two things that their bit of this complex mix can actually do to begin to solve what look like really difficult problems just at the moment. So I think it is about how do we build that network, that community sense. And I just want to make sure that if we did wrap up with something like that, have I sort of broadly captured where people's heads are at this morning? Because as I say, today is part of an ongoing conversation. And if anything comes out of this, it has to be a few clear recommendations around what do we want to do next? And what actions do we want to really focus on where we can actually do it? Because it's all very well jumping up and down and sort of trying to change things we can't change. Do people, I'm seeing some nods and a few sort of digital nods around the table. So on the basis of trying to stick to my Zoom rules, which is never overrun on a meeting and ideally sort of wrap up after about 50 minutes, which is usually about the limit to make it work. Are there any final comments from individuals that they would want to see put in? Either shout out or put them into the chat function and we can capture them. Great. I think that's great. Bernadette, have you got enough that you need from this to sort of condense? Is there anything else that you would need?
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, everyone. It has been a very fascinating hour. And Ian, I think you summed it up beautifully. And it is the piece about in what can we commit if we have a future that we're working towards, a future that we've agreed on, and there is broad consensus across the group from what I could hear this morning, and it'll be interesting to see how the rest of the week goes. But what is it that we can do as individuals, as organisations, as a community? What can we commit to? And if one of those things is to have further conversations around the opportunities to collaborate when we can actually put our time, our energies into working towards an agreed future, then that's a good starting point to our forum, I think. Great. Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, everyone. I look forward to joining you throughout the rest of the week.
Thanks, everybody, and thank you so much for giving up time in what is everybody's very, very busy calendars. All the very best, and look forward to seeing as many of you as possible physically in the not too distant future. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Just going to remind you to stop recording.
Yes.